The 1980s gave us neon lights, arcade cabinets, and shoulder pads. But in the world of horror, it gave us monsters, madness, and stories that became legends. This was the decade when horror wasn't just a genre, it was a cultural juggernaut. And today, the numbers will reveal the 30 novels, three for each year, that stood above them all. Join me. Welcome back to Fantasy for the Ages. I'm Jim, the father of this channel that I do with my son, and this is the third installment in our series of the best three horror novels of each year through the decades. Zach's not here today, it's just me flying solo, but I think you're going to enjoy your time hanging with me. If you do, don't forget to like, subscribe if you haven't done it yet, and click that notification bell so you don't miss any future content. We have already explored the eerie pages of the 1960s and the bloody rise of the 1970s, and now we're stepping into the 1980s, a decade when horror didn't just sell, it dominated. From paperbacks stacked in drugstores to blockbusters adapted for film, this was when the genre went big time. But as always, these rankings are not my personal opinion in this series. Instead, they come from a formula that weighs three things. Firstly, long-term sales. Which books actually moved the most copies over the years? Second, award recognition. Professional acclaim, nominations, other prizes they might have garnered. And number three, fan ratings. I average the scores across Goodreads, Storygraph, and Amazon and get myself a general score. So, when you combine sales, acclaim, and fan love, you get the definitive list of horror greatness. And the data does not lie. Let's find out which three novels ruled the shadows of the 1980s. We begin with the first year, 1980, and here's our third place novel, The Night Boat by Robert McCammon. This is supernatural horror and is a standalone novel. A marine salvage diver discovers a submerged U-boat in a Caribbean lagoon, only for the vessel to rise, and for its long-dead crew to emerge, still alive. As the nightmare unfolds, reality and history twist together in chilling, surreal fashion. Tension escalates from eerie discovery to relentless haunting. Though not as renowned as McCammon's later work, fans value this book's haunting premise and atmospheric execution. Number two for the year is The Cellar by Richard Lehman. This is splatterpunk, extreme horror, and is the beginning of the Beast House Chronicles. Donna and her daughter Sandy are stranded near Beast House, a sinister tourist attraction with a deadly creature. As Donna confronts her traumatic past, they fight both the monster and a predatory world that has already stalked them. Violence escalates to grotesque extremes as the horror intensifies. This is a defining work of splatterpunk. The Cellar is raw, visceral, and unrelenting. Lehman's fearless approach to taboo themes, gore, trauma, exploitation, created a quake in horror fiction, gaining cult status among hardcore fans. But first place for 1980 is Firestarter by Stephen King. This is a supernatural thriller, sci-fi horror, and is a standalone novel. Charlie McGee, a young girl with pyrokinetic powers, becomes targeted by a ruthless government agency determined to weaponize her abilities. Her father races to protect her against mounting paranoia, despair, and institutional evil. Together, their explosive connection becomes both salvation and terror. This is another of King's novels to spawn an excellent film adaptation in 1984 with a young Drew Barrymore. Now, as an aside, at the age of 8, this was already Barrymore's fifth movie and third major film in theaters behind 1980's Altered States and 1982's E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Firestarter's portrayal of a special child hunted by impersonal power struck a nerve and cemented Stephen King's status as a genre titan. Moving to 1981, our number 3 book of the year by the data is The Beast Within by Edward Levy. This is lycanthropic horror and a creature feature. It's a standalone novel. On a remote Ozarks farm, religious fervor and long held paranoia give birth to a literal monster when the doctor's child channels ancestral evil. As secrecy and violence swirl, the family's fractures widen and terror mounts. The beast is both external and refracted through human guilt and sin. Bold and visceral, this is a rare American take on werewolf horror that does not hold back. The 1982 film adaptation further solidified its niche status among body horror and creature feature fans. The second best book of the year is The Elementals by Michael McDowell. This is Southern Gothic, haunted house horror, and is a standalone novel. Two families vacationing on a remote Florida dune discover sinister, invisible forces, spirits of the land that manipulate the landscape and their psyches. As sand shifts beneath them, reality bends with creeping malevolence, turning leisure into horror. Surviving hinges on facing the Earth's own dark legacy. But the number 1 book of the year, best horror by the data, is Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. This is psychological horror and a serial killer thriller. It's the first in the Hannibal Lecter series. Former FBI profiler Will Graham is drawn out of retirement to profile a serial killer dubbed the Tooth Fairy. His only aide is the brilliant but imprisoned Dr. Hannibal Lecter, a cannibalistic psychiatrist with insight and intentions of his own. As the hunt unfolds, Graham's own psyche is ravaged by the horrors he studies. A landmark in horror literature, it introduced Hannibal Lecter and transformed crime horror hybrid fiction. Continuing on to 1982, the third best book of the year was Floating Dragon by Peter Straub. This is supernatural horror and another standalone novel. In affluent suburban Hampstead, evil resurfaces in cyclical visitations, each worse than the last. 4 residents with entangled histories realize the town itself is the stage for something older and vaster than folklore. Their personal failures become doorways to a shape-shifting terror. Second best horror novel of the year is a little of an outlier. The Dark Tower, Book 1, The Gunslinger by Stephen King. This is dark fantasy, but it's definitely horror adjacent. I know some of you will disagree with me, but I'm feeling it. Roland Deschain, the last gunslinger, chases the man in black across a dying world that rhymes with our own. Along the way, he bargains with fate, memory, and a boy named Jake, choices that cost dearly. The trek toward the tower begins with dust, echoes, and a promise of cosmic dread. Even as a limited first, it launched King's signature saga, later exploding in readership. The book's stark, weird Western vibe and occult undertow make it catnip for horror fans who like their darkness mythic. But the number 1 book of the year in horror is again a little different. The Running Man by Richard Bachman, which is actually Stephen King. We established that in the previous decade. This is a dystopian thriller, but definitely horror adjacent, and is a standalone novel from the Bachman era. In a collapsing America, Ben Richards enters a lethal game show where hunters can kill him anywhere, anytime. On live TV, Running buys cash for his family and a chance to expose a rigged system. Each city, each ally, and each lie draws him closer to an ending he can't outrun. A propulsive, angry novel that predicted exploitative reality TV and surveillance culture. The 1987 film, and a new adaptation in the works, keeps demand high, helping give it the strongest sales tale of this trio. For 1983, in third place, we've got Monkey Shines by Michael Stewart. This is psychological horror and science fiction, and is a standalone novel. A quadriplegic law student receives a service monkey, Ella, whose programming, or perhaps consciousness, starts channeling his suppressed rage, traversing protector into predator. As Ella's behavior escalates, boundaries blur between beast and master, innocence and violence. This eerie fusion of disability narrative and rogue science redefined psychological horror. Its cataclysmic twist and unconventional premise have made it a cult standout, and a 1988 Romero film adaptation underscores its impact. In second place for the year, we've got Shrine by James Herbert. This is supernatural horror and religious cult horror. It's a standalone, although it is preceded by The Jonah. A deaf-mute child is miraculously healed and suddenly becomes a magnet for religious adulation and media frenzy. As the village transforms into a pilgrimage site, a reporter and local priest sense mounting spiritual corruption. Beneath the surface glamour, an ancient, potentially demonic force lurks. With blistering pace, theological dread, and moral ambivalence, Herbert's novel probes fanaticism with savage intellect. But the number one book of the year in horror is The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. This is a gothic horror ghost story and is a standalone novel. Solicitor Arthur Kipps is sent to settle the estate of a recluse in the remote Eelmarsh house, but is confronted by a spectral woman in black whose presence heralds tragedy, particularly for children. The spectral visits haunt his psyche and reality, culminating in a chilling final visitation with devastating consequences. Minimalistic, atmospheric, and deeply unsettling, this tale of spooky marshland and spectral revenge redefined modern ghost storytelling. Moving to 1984, our third best horror novel of the year by the numbers is Who Made Stevie Cry by Michael Bishop. This is supernatural horror metafiction and is a standalone novel. A widowed writer's typewriter begins to transcribe her nightmares and even forecast her future, becoming a conduit for horror. As reality and fiction merge, the act of creating becomes literally dangerous. Her struggle blurs the monstrous and the imagined. Number 2 for the year is Thinner by Stephen King, writing as Richard Bachman. This is supernatural horror and a standalone novel. After killing a Romani elder in an accident, a powerful lawyer finds himself cursed to waste away rapidly. As his flesh deteriorates, the curse becomes a desperate and personal horror. He must confront both supernatural vengeance and his own conscience. Thinner offers potent allegory, raw emotional weight, and a relentless creeping dread. Its twist and punishment are morally complex, and this novel's reveal that Bachman was king sent book sales soaring. But number 1 for the year goes to Domain by James Herbert. Post-apocalyptic horror and splatter horror. This is written as a standalone novel, but it is the third in his Rats trilogy, so it's not really standalone. In a world decimated by nuclear war, mutated rats fight to reclaim Earth, beginning with urban London. Humanity's survival teeters as the venomous hordes wage gruesome biological warfare. Society is collapsing, held back only by blood and dread. Herbert turns rat horror into dystopian mass terror on a grand, bloody scale. It became a bestseller, cementing the trilogy's legacy for splatter and apocalypse horror. Continuing to 1985, the number 3 horror novel of the year is The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. This is gothic horror and vampire fantasy and is the second book in the Vampire Chronicles. This lush sequel flips the perspective, letting the infamous Lestat narrate his own transformation from mortal to vampire. Through centuries of decadent adventures, we see his defiance, curiosity, and hunger for both beauty and power. Lestat's tale reframes events from Book 1, Interview with the Vampire, challenging everything readers thought they knew. Fans adore Lestat's charisma, moral complexity, and the deep operatic world building Rice delivers. It's considered one of the greatest sympathetic monster novels ever written. Many regard it as the book that made the Vampire Chronicles explode in popularity. The second best book of the year in the horror category is Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. This is a short story horror collection and is a standalone anthology, though some of the individual stories do link loosely to King's wider universe. A sprawling anthology of 22 short works, Skeleton Crew moves from sea monsters in The Mist to twisted fairy tales, The Monkey, to bleak survival horror, Survivor type. King experiments with horror's many shades, blending cosmic dread with dark humor. Every page brims with that trademark King knack for making the ordinary terrifying. It's beloved for its variety. There's truly something to scare everyone. The Mist alone became a modern horror classic, later adapted into a feature film and a TV series. It wasn't very good, but the film, But number one for the year goes to Twilight Eyes by Dean Koontz. This is a horror thriller and is fantasy tinged. It's a standalone. An expanded version came later, but the original was published here in 1985. Slim Mackenzie, a psychic hunter of goblin shapeshifters, follows his uncanny vision to a carnival where darkness sits masked against carnival lights. As he tracks these monsters that walk among us, the boundary between human and monster collapses. His own abilities become both weapon and curse. Its blend of psychic suspense and urban myth is quintessential Kuntz, with less sentiment and more stark dread. Continuing to 1986, our number 3 horror novel of the year is The Doll Who Ate His Mother by Ramsey Campbell. What a title. The genre is just horror, and it's a standalone novel. After his brother's death in a bizarre accident, Claire teams up with a horror writer and a troubled man to track down a killer in Liverpool. Their hunt leads to a depraved murderer with disturbing family ties. The journey forces them into psychological as well as physical darkness. Campbell's mix of urban decay, psychological unease, and supernatural undertones is masterful. The second best horror novel of the year goes to The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. This is horror and dark fantasy and is a standalone novel, though it forms the basis of the whole Hellraiser franchise. Frank Cotton opens a puzzle box that summons the Cenobites, beings who offer sensations beyond pleasure and pain. When he escapes their grasp in horrific form, his former lover becomes his reluctant accomplice, but the Cenobites are never far behind. Barker's novella is both visceral horror and twisted philosophy about desire and consequence. Its imaginative cruelty and erotic grotesquerie made it an instant cult classic. Fans adore its blend of beauty, dread, and boundary-pushing invention. But the number one book of the year in the horror category had to go to It by Stephen King. This is a horror novel and it's a standalone, though it has though it has connections to King's multiverse. In the town of Derry, Maine, 7 children confront a shape-shifting entity that emerges every 27 years to prey on fear. The monster, often appearing as Pennywise the Clown, returns decades later, forcing the now adult friends to remember the past and fight again. The story blends terror with deep themes of memory, friendship, loss of innocence, and the courage to face evil head on. It is widely regarded as one of the greatest horror novels ever written, combining small-town nostalgia with primal archetypal fears. Pennywise became a genre icon, and the novel's scope cemented King's reputation. Its emotional core gives the scares lasting power. Going on to 1987, our third best horror novel of the year is Weave World by Clive Barker. This is dark fantasy, horror adjacent, and is a standalone novel. Calhoun Mooney discovers a hidden world, the Fugue, woven into a carpet, a realm threatened by monstrous evil. He and Susanna Parrish must defend this magical world against human greed and eldritch corruption. The narrative blends mythic wonder with visceral horror. Barker's imaginative scope is striking. The novel blends fairy tale beauty, baroque horror, and epic stakes. Second best horror novel of the year, it goes to Misery by Stephen King. This is psychological horror and a thriller. It's a standalone novel. Novelist Paul Sheldon is rescued from a crash and imprisoned by his number one fan, Annie Wilkes. As she forces him to rewrite his novel, captor and captive spiral into a twisted dance of control and resistance. The tension is both psychological and physical, gripping from first page to terrifying climax. Misery is iconic for its intense psychological tension and unforgettable antagonist. Its blend of suspense, character study, and cultural impact, including an Oscar winning film, make it a standout of 1980s horror. The film literally made me a Kathy Bates fan, and I'd watch anything with her in it after that. Titanic forever. But the number one horror novel of the year goes to The Tommyknockers by Stephen King. There he goes, Stevie. Two in a row. Sci-fi horror this time, and supernatural. It's also a standalone novel, though it is part of King's broader universe. A writer discovers a buried alien ship, and its energy begins corrupting his small town, transforming people both mentally and physically. Addiction, mutation, and paranoia spread quickly as an otherworldly influence takes hold. Friendships fracture, and the only hope may lie in a desperate rescue effort. The novel's exploration of addiction, paranoia, and alien horror resonates with readers who enjoy body horror grounded in emotional truth. Continuing to 1988, our third best horror novel goes to Coco by Peter Straub. This is horror and supernatural mystery, and it's a standalone novel. A Vietnam War era serial killer resurfaces, and writer Tim Underhill reassembles his old unit, the Blue Rose, to confront both the monster and their own pasts. As the investigation unfolds, the line between hunter and hunted blurs. Unresolved trauma and supernatural undertones twist into psychological dread. Straub weaves psychological depth and haunted memory into a gripping thriller. This World Fantasy Award winning novel remains a high point of intelligent horror fiction. Number two for the year goes to Those Who Hunt the Night by Barbara Hambly. This is horror and mystery in the Gothic style, and is book one of the James Asher Chronicles. In 1920s London, antiquarian James Asher is hired by a vampire senator to hunt rogue undead, unaware that the prey and the hunter share much more than he lets on. As supernatural factions converge, threats come from mythical and societal shadows alike. The investigation becomes a journey into deeply gothic terrors woven between lore, politics, and desire. This novel rewrites vampire myth with literary flair, historical nuance, and sensual dread. But the number one novel of the year in the horror category goes to Haunted by James Herbert. This is horror and a psychological thriller and is a standalone novel. A man and his family move into a house whose walls echo with screams from the past, and soon the terror becomes intimate. Layers of violence and regret seep into the home until boundaries between its history and the present blur. It's a descent into madness sparked by haunting, regret, and the indelible stain of memory. This is a feast for horror fans seeking atmosphere rooted in emotional collapse. Haunted is often highlighted as one of the most atmospheric and deeply unsettling novels. Our final year of the decade, 1989, brings us in third place, Funland by Richard Lehman. This is splatter horror and is a standalone novel. In the resort town of Bolita Bay, a wave of brutal murders overtakes guests in and around Funland, a rundown amusement park. A group of survivors navigate blood soaked corridors of horror, only to discover the darkness lies deeper than the park's rusted gates. As bodies mount, survival depends on facing both flesh and blood menace and supernatural dread. Layman pours unrelenting pace, gory detail, and claustrophobic dread into a carnival turned nightmare, making Funland a defining work in splatter horror. The second best horror novel of 1989 goes to Midnight by Dean Koontz. Supernatural horror and also science fiction suspense, this is a standalone novel. In Moonlight Cove, paranoia and regression grip the townsfolk, driving them toward monstrous transformation. FBI agent wraps in supernatural conspiracy to unravel the horrific events, a blend of science gone wrong and primal terror. The truth, when revealed, is as shocking as it is terrifying. Kuntz scored a major bestseller with this genre melding thriller, supernatural, chilling, and emotionally sharp. But the number one book of 1989 in the horror genre goes to The Dark Half by Stephen King. This is psychological horror and a dark fantasy. It's a standalone novel. Writer Thad Beaumont's pseudonym comes to life as a murderous doppelganger, and only the author can stop him. The line between creator and creation shatters as King explores identity, authorship, and violent autonomy. Penny for Your Soul meets psychological terror in a brilliantly twisted mirror image. Regarded as one of King's darkest and most introspective novels, The Dark Half combines genre shattering concept, bestseller success, and mainstream cultural penetration. It also spawned a successful film, cementing its long term impact. And there we have it, the three novels of each year that rose above the crowded field of 80s horror. These weren't just one hit wonders. They became touchstones for fans, critics, and collectors alike, holding their power through decades of sales, acclaim, and high ratings. Did the data surprise you this time? Or did your favorite make the cut? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Spoiler-lite, of course. And let's see if the fandom agrees with the numbers. If you enjoyed this episode, remember, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe so you catch the next decade. And as always, a huge thank you to our Patreon supporters. You're the reason we can keep this content coming out. Next time, we'll dive into the 1990s, a decade where horror evolved, twisted, and sometimes turned inward in unexpected ways. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep the lights low and continue scaring yourself with terrifying tales. We'll talk to you next time.